Why didn't the Chernobyl disaster wipe out all wild boars? Surely, all of us know that Chernobyl is a name associated with one of the most terrifying nuclear disasters in human history. More than 38 years have passed since the explosion. The sky that year was colored by dust, and hundreds of thousands of people were forced to leave their homeland forever. Radioactive materials spread everywhere, taking the lives of countless people, and completely changing this land. People thought this place would become a dead zone, where no living creature could survive anymore. However, something strange happened in that heavily contaminated area. Herds of wild boars and some other creatures continued to thrive vigorously. Not only did they not go extinct, but they developed in an astonishing way. As if nuclear radiation had no effect on them at all. Why is that? Do wild boars have a special ability to resist radiation, or is there another mystery? Let's uncover it right in today. Let's start with the Chernobyl disaster event in 1986, when a large amount of CS-137, a radioactive isotope, with a half-life of over 30 years, was released into the environment. Scientists believed that over time, the radiation level would decrease by at least half. And reality has proven that, as over 3 decades have passed, the contamination levels in many animal species in the area have risen. For example, in deer, studies show that the radiation in their bodies has lowered year by year. Which is completely reasonable, as CS-137 is gradually washed away by rainwater, sinks deep into the soil, and is no longer absorbed by plants as much as before. However, when scientists examined the meat of wild boars in Chernobyl, something strange occurred. They found that the radiation levels in the boar meat were still very high, almost no different from right after the disaster. The radiation was so intense that their meat was completely inedible. Why did other species see reduced contamination, but wild boars alone did not? This became a challenging scientific puzzle, named the wild boar paradox. Initially, some hypotheses suggested that CS-137 might accumulate longer in the fatty tissues of wild boar, but subsequent studies refuted this. It wasn't until 2023 that the mystery was solved. A team of scientists used more advanced measurement methods and discovered that wild boars were not only contaminated with CS-137 from the Chernobyl disaster but also carried another isotope, CS-135. An isotope with a much longer half-life than CS-137 and extremely difficult to detect with conventional equipment. But where did CS-135 come from? How did wild boars become so heavily contaminated? And why didn't the radiation levels in their bodies decrease over time? Scientists investigated and found that the cause might stem from the wild boars' feeding habits. When studying boars in the Bavaria region, they realized that this conclusion could apply to Chernobyl boars as well. Notably, this animal's favorite food is deer truffles, a type of fungus growing deep underground, at depths of 8 to 16 centimeters. Since cesium seeps into the soil very slowly, these fungi began absorbing radioactive isotopes from the Chernobyl nuclear disaster and passing them to wild boars through the food chain. But the story doesn't end there. Further studies revealed a surprising fact. Cesium-135 had been present in the soil since the 1960s, from the time of nuclear weapons testing. When analyzing wild boars, scientists were amazed to find that most of the cesium in their bodies did not come from Chernobyl but was linked to nuclear bomb tests. In some test samples, this proportion reached 68%. The reason is that cesium moves very slowly, only about 0.4 centimeters per year, and as deer truffles absorb radiation, it became a long-term radioactive source for wild boars. Notably, cesium-135 has a half-life of tens of years, meaning that even after the Chernobyl disaster, this radiation continues to persist in the soil. If it could be sensed, even the mushrooms might be surprised by this. This phenomenon isn't limited to Chernobyl, it also occurs in Germany. A large number of wild boars that are so contaminated that hunters must have the meat tested after capture. Not because of excessive government control, but because the radiation levels in the meat are dangerously high, forcing disposal. This has led many hunters to abandon wild boar hunting, inadvertently allowing the species population to overgrow, causing ecological imbalance. It's surprising that radioactive wild boars not only exist in the Chernobyl exclusion zone but also appear in Germany, thousands of kilometers away. Initially, scientists couldn't understand why this was happening, but ultimately the answer pointed back to an event that seemed forgotten. Nuclear tests from over 60 years ago. As long as cesium remains in the soil, radiation levels in wild boars won't decrease for a long time. A similar story once happened with reindeer, not far away but in Norway. Nearly 40 years have passed since the Chernobyl disaster, but its effects are still present. In 1986, when a nuclear power plant exploded, wind carried radioactive dust hundreds of kilometers. In Norway, due to prolonged heavy rain, about 0.7 kilograms of radioactive cesium-137 fell to the ground, which is no small amount. This radioactive substance seeped into the soil, water, and forests, causing many plants and berries to become contaminated. Among them is a species called legion, a plant without roots that absorbs nutrients directly from the air. Consequently, it also absorbs cesium-137, becoming a radioactive food source that reindeer accidentally consume. Perhaps this is why the story of Santa Claus's reindeer with glowing red noses suddenly became more realistic than ever. But behind that is a sad reality. These animals are contaminated with radiation, and their meat has become dangerous. Scientists confirmed this in 1986, and even when rechecked in 2014. They still detected traces of radiation in the bodies of reindeer in this area. However, there is a more interesting question. Does radiation really create mutated creatures like in movies? In popular culture, Chernobyl is often associated with bizarre creatures, even bloodthirsty monsters. But the reality is not like that. Scientific studies show that the radiation shot from the explosion plus long-term exposure to small doses has caused many changes in the shape, health, and genes of animal species in this area. However, the mutations are not enough to create terrifying creatures as imagined. After the disaster, many animal species in the area were severely affected, with higher tumor rates, weakened immune systems, shorter lifespans, and accelerated aging. Some species even suffered serious blood and internal organ issues. These factors make them more prone to death, but not enough to turn them into monsters. Today, many people still find animals that appear healthy in the Chernobyl area. This leads scientists to believe they may have migrated here after the disaster, rather than being descendants of creatures that survived the explosion. But there are also species that truly survived the disaster, notably dogs. When scientists collected DNA samples from dogs in Chernobyl, they discovered they are descendants of dogs that lived there at the time of the disaster. Although there are no strange mutations, they have adapted in a very different way, with larger bodies and especially no fear of humans. Not only dogs, but many other species like foxes, wolves, deer, and even bears are increasingly appearing in the Chernobyl area. With no humans there for decades, these animals have gradually dominated the deserted land. Perhaps nature is finding its own way to balance and recover. And it could be said that the Chernobyl disaster brought an unexpected opportunity for the animal world. Of course, no one denies the losses and severe consequences radiation has caused for humans and the surrounding environment. But a strange phenomenon occurred. When humans were forced to leave, nature revived strongly. The deer population doubled just 10 years after humans left, while the wolf population in the area also grew robustly, with a density over 7 times higher than similar areas. Scientists believe it's not radiation but the absence of humans that is the key factor, helping animals multiply and expand their territory. But if so, why haven't strange mutated creatures appeared, like in science fiction movies? In reality, radiation can cause mutations, but the process isn't as simple as many think. Short-lived organisms, like microorganisms or insects, can change rapidly. But for larger animals, radiation mainly causes physical damage, rather than creating mutations that can be inherited by future generations. For significant genetic changes to occur, radiation must directly affect reproductive cells. But with such high doses, organisms usually cannot survive. That's why there are no giant rats or deer with tentacles, only very small, sometimes unnoticeable changes. However, not all species can adapt well to the harsh environment after the disaster. Most animal species in the contaminated area have shorter lifespans, with populations gradually decreasing over time as background radiation levels rise. But among the species, there are still resilient survivors, one of which is the wild boar. Wild boars are endowed by nature with incredible survival abilities. They can adapt to all living conditions, from cold to heat, from environments rich in food to places scarce in nutrients. But most importantly is their astonishing reproduction rate. A female wild boar can give birth twice a year, with 5 to 7 piglets per litter. After about 6 months, the piglets are mature enough to reproduce themselves. Creating a continuous reproductive cycle helps them maintain and expand their population rapidly. Meanwhile, deer have a much slower reproduction rate. They only reproduce once a year, typically giving birth to 1 or 2 offspring per litter. And it takes nearly a year before they can become pregnant again. When the Chernobyl disaster occurred in April, deer had not yet entered their breeding season, which meant they couldn't quickly increase their numbers to compensate for lost individuals. In contrast, wild boars are not limited by a breeding season. As long as they find a mate, they can reproduce year-round, even when the environment changes harshly. As long as a few individuals survive, they can quickly rebuild the population. In nature, species with fast reproduction abilities often have higher chances of survival. Wild boars not only have good resistance to harsh environmental conditions, but can also eat almost anything to sustain life. Thanks to this flexible adaptability, they not only survived the nuclear disaster but also thrived, becoming one of the dominant species in the abandoned area of Chernobyl. And did you know, it's not just the wild boars in Chernobyl that possess such strong vitality, but a similar story is unfolding in Fukushima. The 2011 nuclear disaster turned this place into a forbidden zone, and even now, the area within a 2-mile radius around the plant remains uninhabited by people. But strangely, wild boars are thriving there. Researchers say that after the disaster, the number of wild boars in the area increased rapidly. In just 4 years, they multiplied from 3,000 to 13,000 individuals. Abandoned houses, empty buildings have now become shelters, even breeding grounds for wild boars. Although their meat samples contain cesium-137 radiation levels 300 times the safe limit, the wild boars remain healthy with no abnormal signs. However, for local residents, this is a major problem. Wild boars destroy crops, invade residential areas, and authorities have placed penalties for hunting them. But they reproduce so quickly that humans can hardly control them. Not only wild boars, this land is also home to a strange species of wolves. The wolves in Chernobyl have naturally developed cancer resistance. It may sound unbelievable, but scientists have confirmed this. Compared to wolves outside the exclusion zone, Chernobyl wolves have genetic differences, as if they've developed special mutations to resist cancer, even in heavily radioactive environments. This is an important discovery because if studied further, humans might find ways to apply this mechanism in cancer treatment. And not just wolves, but also herds of wild horses. Few know that a special horse species lives in Chernobyl. Przewalski wild horses, previously thought to be extinct in the wild. But a few years ago, 36 horses were introduced to the Chernobyl area in a conservation effort. Unexpectedly, without humans, they thrived. The abandoned structures here became their shelters, and this forgotten land turned into an unexpected natural sanctuary. Thanks to this, Przewalski horses escaped the risk of extinction once again. However, not all animals were so fortunate. When the Chernobyl disaster occurred in 1986, thousands of people hastily left their homeland, leaving behind their loyal pets. Hundreds of dogs and cats were abandoned, wandering the wilderness for decades. But recently, organizations have stepped in to rescue them. These animals are taken out of the radioactive area, given health checks, vaccinations, sterilization, and found new homes in the United States. A difficult journey, but one carrying hope for a new life for these small creatures once forgotten. It can be seen that both Chernobyl and Fukushima bear deep wounds from nuclear disasters. But nature still finds a way to regenerate. The forests, with their intense vitality and astonishing adaptability, have become symbols of resilience in a land that seemed dead. This not only shows the power of nature, but also reminds us that even if humans leave, nature continues its cycle. But is this life truly a positive sign? Or just a sad paradox when these creatures carry the scars of the past? That remains an open question for scientists and all of us. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and support. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next fascinating discoveries. Hello and see you again in the next Journeys with Tia Mom.